On this episode of Squatchbot, I am heading into the field in a very remote location to investigate a recent incident involving a large, unidentified creature. This area has had significant reported Sasquatch activity in the past, and since the initial posting of this incident on a local community forum, numerous residents have come forward to share their own unusual happenings in this area, and several of these accounts directly mention Bigfoot. The location is in very close proximity to my encounter location from March 3rd, 2020, and Area X. There are a number of environmental nuances in the area that I believe are very enticing to the Sasquatch, and although the Sasquatch are usually at much higher elevations this time of year, recent fires in the region may have altered the Sasquatch's movement patterns, and having recently discovered juvenile Sasquatch footprint impressions nearby, I am compelled to believe there are still Sasquatch at these lower elevations, and we need to investigate why. There's something in the environment, and it could be a Sasquatch. It's all coming up next on Squatchbot.
Hello and welcome to Squatchbot. I'm Darrin Smith, and we are heading into a very remote location to investigate some possible Sasquatch activity.
The incident we are investigating occurred on July 18th, 2021, in a very remote camp near the south entrance of Yosemite National Park. This area has had significant reported Sasquatch activity over the years, as well as unidentified lights in the sky, mysterious fog, and other paranormal activity. It is in very close proximity to my encounter location from March 3rd, 2020, as well as Area X. And having recently discovered juvenile Sasquatch footprint impressions nearby, I am compelled to believe there are still Sasquatch at these lower elevations. At approximately 9:35 p.m., as the witness and his father sat at their camp, he heard something large stumble and fall in the nearby woods. The creature let out a loud gasp as it hit the ground. Though they could not see the unidentified creature, the witness recounts the creature made several bluff charges towards their direction, noting he could feel the ground shake as the creature moved, implying it was of considerable weight. Attempts to chase the creature off by yelling and making loud noises failed, so they fired 2 shots with their gun into the ground with hopes of chasing the creature off. However, the creature remained. Unsettled by the experience, the two abandoned their camp and fled the area. Returning to the location the following day to collect their gear, the witness discovered several deer tracks in the area. However, he also discovered 2 impressions he could not identify. However, he surmised the creature that had left them was of considerable weight. The witness has been coming to this area for the past 14 years and has never had a similar encounter. Another oddity mentioned in the report: arriving at their campsite location, the witness discovered an abandoned camp nearby with multiple tents, gear, and half-eaten food on the table. However, in the 4 days he was in the area, no one was ever spotted at the abandoned camp.
Okay, as you can see, it is the end of the road for us, at least pulling in this route. So I'm going to kind of pull out the maps and kind of look for some sort of alternative route that will get us into the general area that we are wanting to investigate. However, I will point out the roads leading into this area are absolutely treacherous, and with my low clearance vehicle, it is definitely not making it easy to get into the area. So I'm definitely going to have to pay attention to the road conditions and the amount of time it's taking me to get in and the amount of time it's going to take me to get out, because I don't think it's going to necessarily be a good thing to be stranded out in this area. And with no cell service, it is definitely something that I am going to have to be paying close attention to, because if something was to happen with my vehicle, it is very likely that I would have to hike out. And at this point, it's not really an arduous task to get back to civilization in a sense. But if I continue up the mountain and get up into those remote areas, it may pose a little bit of a challenge for us to be getting out of this area. So at this point, I'm just going to regroup and kind of do some recon with the various maps that I have and just see if there is another route that we can take to get into this area, and then just kind of go from there. Okay, I was able to get in a bit further into the area. However, I ended up at a river crossing, and I don't think it is a good idea for me to attempt this river crossing in my low clearance vehicle, because unfortunately, if something was to happen, especially to my vehicle out in this very remote location, I am going to be in a little bit of a precarious state, because it is going to take me a considerable amount of time to hike out of this area. And it's not an ideal situation, because if for some reason the vehicle was to get stuck, it would be very difficult to get a tow truck up here to get the vehicle out. So I think it's important for me to play it safe and to stop at this location and not continue further into this area. And there are a number of vantage points to get into the encounter location. And it was kind of a crapshoot, and I thought this was going to be the easier of the two routes, but I was unable to get into the actual encounter location. However, the encounter location is in very close proximity to the location we are currently in. So I am considering hiking the rest of the way into that area just to investigate it. But I also think if that Sasquatch is in the area, it is going to be moving around in this environment, and it is very possible that the Sasquatch is in this general area. So I'm definitely going to be scouring around looking for any sort of physical evidence that the Sasquatch are in the area. And I am going to look at maybe making arrangements to stay the night here and venture into that location on foot. So a number of things I have to think about at this point, and we are kind of getting into that mid-afternoon time frame. So I really have to start making a plan here.
Although it was a long and arduous journey to get into this location, and it was going to take a significant amount of time to get back out, I could not overlook the recent activity in the area and the opportunity to encounter a Sasquatch. So I decided to park my vehicle and begin a preliminary investigation of the area, hiking towards the incident site. During the previous clip, you may have heard it. As I moved into the area, I heard two very unusual howl-like sounds coming from the gorge below me. The terrain, however, was very steep, and I did not chance climbing down the embankment. However, a preliminary analysis has been done on the audio, and it does support that the sound was considerably loud and was coming from a significant distance. Here's the clip again. Though the sound is still as yet unidentified, at the time I did find it very intriguing, and I decided to continue my investigation of the area. During the initial audio analysis, I was intrigued with the vocal range, tone, and power of the vocalization. The sound was coming from a significant distance, and clearly it was coming from a very large animal.
So you can see behind me there's a game trail, and there are just numerous heavily used game trails in this area. And oftentimes game trails are moving to and from water sources, so they are definitely major thoroughfares as the animals are heading for those water sources. And also the Sasquatch are using these game trails, in my belief, because I think the Sasquatch are incredibly intelligent, and they understand that the animals are generally creatures of habit, and they are moving frequently along these game trails. So I definitely think the Sasquatch are going to be monitoring these game trails when searching for prey, and also when heading down to those water sources that are in the area, because these animals are going to be needing an incredible amount of water, especially during these drier, warmer seasons. So I definitely spend a lot of time investigating the game trails in the area. So I don't know if you could see this impression here, but I do like it. There's one here, there's one there, and they're leading up this embankment here. And I do not think these are bear tracks. And I'm going to give it a quick measure here. So I've definitely been scouring this area, and this trackway here looks good, but as you can see, we're on some heavily pine forest floor, but we do have one here that's clear. There's another impression there. These are measuring at just about 14 inches, 8 by about 6, so that is a good size. And we have one impression here, another impression here, and they're leading up this embankment. So this is interesting, and I'm going to continue scouring this environment to see if I can find an area that has a medium that is much more conducive for leaving these footprint impressions, because it's very difficult to get detail on this heavily debris covered pine forest floor. But this is definitely interesting, and I like this trackway here. So I'm pretty much certain you guys are tired of me mentioning the buckbrush. However, I'm going to do so again here. You can see behind me here on this embankment, there are some very interesting impressions leading up the embankment and into the buckbrush. And as I mentioned numerous times before, I think the Sasquatch are using the buckbrush to create a barrier around them to prevent other animals and people from moving into their environment as they're resting. And as I mentioned numerous times, the nest site that I discovered was completely surrounded by thick buckbrush, with the exception of two distinct pathways that were groomed. The plants were definitely groomed in a way that it created pathways into that nest site. So I absolutely believe the Sasquatch are utilizing the buckbrush as a safety measure to protect them, and I am very intrigued by these impressions that are leading up to the buckbrush, and I'm definitely going to be investigating them. Okay, so it looks to be about 14 and a half by roughly 8. And roughly 7. So those impressions are, the impression is, I think, a little exaggerated because the measurements are a little askew here. But that's what I have on this little slant here. And I can see the impressions are just leading up this embankment into the buckbrush. So I'm going to go handheld here so you can see the impressions are either, this one I was kind of assuming it was coming down the embankment, but it could be going up the embankment because the other impressions appear to be heading up the embankment. And as we head up into the area, we're following the impressions up the embankment. You can see some of the branches here have been broken and they're laying on the ground here. So if there were branches here, they could have been taken out. If a Sasquatch was moving through the area, you could see that branch there has been broken off. So this whole area is void of branches, which implies that something very large had moved through the area. And you can see here it has gone up and into the buckbrush. And I don't know if you could see in the background there, the buckbrush has been pushed down. It's been, definitely something has moved through that area and got up into the buckbrush. And I'm definitely not going to be moving through it because the needle sharp thorns are incredibly painful. But you can see the vegetation there. It's pushed down. And it looks like maybe there it came out and then veered to the left there because the buckbrush is very thick up there. And I think whatever moved through the area moved through, and then in that little space there, it moved up into the forest there. So this is really interesting because we can clearly see that something has moved through the buckbrush. And these impressions here are very interesting. And seeing that the trees here are void of branches in this area implies that something very large had moved through the area, because I don't need to duck down to get through there. It's completely void of branches. I can move right through it. And you can see, I don't know on this one, yeah, it does look like the tip has been broken off. And there's definitely some branches, like this one here, that are on the ground here. So it does look like something very large had moved through this area. And you can see here's another branch that appears to be broken off. So I think it's very clear to me that something very large had moved up that embankment and got into the buckbrush. And I do find this very intriguing because those footprint impressions, the measurements were a little askew because it was on an embankment, and I can see if something very heavy had stepped on that heavily debris pine needle forest floor there, I could see how the impression could slide a little bit and then elongate. So those impressions were pretty consistent with the other impressions that we found in the area. And I do think it's interesting that these impressions clearly moved up into that buckbrush. We saw how the vegetation was pushed down and how whatever it was moved up into that forest environment above the buckbrush. And I've mentioned this numerous times before. I absolutely think the Sasquatch moved through the buckbrush. I don't think they have any trouble doing so. And also the fact that those branches were broken among that cluster of trees there, those lower branches that were dried out, they were clearly broken as if something very large had moved through the area. And clearly it wasn't a bear because those branch breaks were at a much higher level. So this is very intriguing, and I am very open to the possibility that a Sasquatch has moved up this embankment and moved into that thick vegetation, that thick buckbrush, because absolutely a human is not going to be powering through that stuff. There's no way. The needle-sharp thorns are just incredibly painful. I mean, there's no way a human is going to pass through that stuff, but we do have reports of Sasquatch being spotted moving through it, so they don't have any trouble getting into it. And I've mentioned numerous times before that I have discovered bedding areas among the buckbrush. They look like areas that were cleared out either up against the buckbrush or actually inside the buckbrush, completely surrounded by the buckbrush, where there's areas that were kind of cleared out as if something was, resting in that spot. Like it looked like a bedding area to me in some of the locations that I've discovered. So this is really interesting. And I am definitely going to look at staying in the environment tonight because these impressions, I would say, are possibly fresh. I mean, I wouldn't say it happened just yesterday or today, but I don't think that they are old impressions. They look fairly fresh, and the other impressions I found in the area also look reasonably fresh. So there is a good shot that if that Sasquatch was in the area recently during that encounter, it is very possible that that Sasquatch is still moving throughout this forest environment and is still in this area. And I think it would be very advantageous for us to spend the night here.
Next time on Squatchbot. Having discovered the interesting footprint impressions leading into the buckbrush and hearing the unusual howls in the nearby gorge, I'm intrigued to believe there may be a Sasquatch in the area. So I decided to remain in the area to continue my investigation and to conduct night surveillance. Alone in the woods and out of communications range, I will not be able to call for help in the event of an emergency.
We won't be able to call for help, so we're definitely going to want to be on our game tonight.
And the road leading out of the area is treacherous and would take an incredible amount of time to traverse. So I am on my own. However, I am far from helpless. I deployed state-of-the-art technology around my camp to alert me if anything moves into the area. I use the parabolic microphone in an attempt to pinpoint sounds in the woods, and I maintain surveillance of the area throughout the evening using the FLIR, and there is a good chance I am not alone.
There's something in the environment, and it could be a Sasquatch.
It's all coming up next time on Squatchbot.